billionaire CEO fired his maid for blowing bubbles. Then his autistic son said his first word in years. Before we dive in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Type your city in the comments so we can see just how far this story reaches. And when we get to the end, I dare you to rate it from 0 to 10, because this one might just break your heart. Now, enjoy the story. In the grand garden of a multi-million-dollar mansion in Connecticut, where silence felt heavier than the marble walls themselves, a single soap bubble drifted upward into the spring sunlight. It wasn't blown by a therapist, nor a doctor, but by Grace, a quiet immigrant housekeeper, scrubbing stone tiles as if she were invisible in a world of wealth and power. And then, something no one expected happened. A 5-year-old boy, the only son of billionaire CEO Jonathan Whitmore, lifted his head. For 16 long months, ever since his mother's passing, Miles had not spoken a single word. Yet, at that fragile bubble, his eyes lit up, and the corners of his lips curved into the faintest smile. One fragile bubble had broken through a wall of silence, something no fortune, no power, not even the finest team of specialists could ever reach. It makes you wonder, could something so small, so ordinary, truly rescue a heart that had nearly gone dark? Stay with me, and you'll see how one invisible woman forever changed the fate of a billionaire's grieving family. They say inside mansions worth tens of millions, you can buy anything except the warmth of a family. The Whitmore estate was living proof. Spanning over 12 acres, its cherry blossoms burst into color each spring. But inside, only silence echoed. Crystal chandeliers lit endless mirrored hallways, yet not a spark of life could be found beneath their glow. On the top floor, Jonathan Whitmore, 38 years old, a widowed CEO commanding a global financial empire, buried himself in reports and billion-dollar decisions. A man powerful enough to bend markets with logic and numbers, yet helpless against the emptiness of his own home. And in the garden, beneath the cherry blossoms, sat little Miles, only 5, but already carrying a silence too heavy for his small shoulders. Since the day he lost his mother, he had not spoken in over a year. His tiny frame curled in on itself, his gaze turned away from the world, retreating into a hidden place no one else could enter. That was when Grace Ellis appeared, 32 years old, an immigrant woman of color, quietly wiping the glass panes, scrubbing the stone floors, in a home where everyone walked past Miles as though he didn't exist. Grace was the only one who paused. She understood that silence is a language. 2. A cold CEO on the top floor, a boy locked in silence, and a woman treated as invisible. 3 lives, 3 worlds, under one roof, no thread connecting them until a single bubble floated into the air and shattered everything. If you've ever lived in a house filled with things, but starved of love, leave a comment below. Perhaps you'll see a piece of yourself in this story. Part 1. The first bubble. The noon sunlight of spring draped over the Whitmore garden like a thin golden silk. Cherry blossoms bloomed in full glory, their petals drifting with every soft breeze. So breathtakingly beautiful, it could make one hold their breath. Yet beneath that splendor, silence hung heavy, as if the place itself had been frozen in time. Grace Ellis knelt by the stone pathway, her knees pressed into the cold ground until they grew numb. Her calloused hands gripped a scrub brush, wringing out water laced with vinegar and soap. The sharp, sour scent clung to her clothes, seeped into her skin, even into her hair. She was used to it, just as she was used to being nothing more than a shadow in this grand estate. No one noticed Grace. To the Whitmore family, she was only the cleaner, a name on a payroll slip at the end of the month. Her presence was so silent that at times she wondered if she truly existed inside this mansion at all. Her eyes shifted toward the far end of the garden. Under the cherry tree sat Miles Jonathan Whitmore's 5-year-old son, his small body curled in on itself, like a living question mark. He never spoke. He never laughed. His gaze was always locked on the ground, as if the world had given him no reason to look up anymore. Grace's heart ached. The sight was all too familiar, yet never less haunting. A 5-year-old should be running, singing, laughing, she whispered. The words, breaking in her throat, meant only for herself. She remembered her first day here. The instructions had been strict. Do not speak directly to Miles. Leave him to the specialists. But how many specialists had come and gone, with their charts, their questions, their expensive devices? Each one left with nothing but sighs and shaking heads, and Miles remained silent as a stone. Grace turned back to her bucket. Her hand brushed the foam clinging to its rim. Tiny bubbles popped one after another, leaving a shimmering film across her fingertips. Suddenly, a memory rose. Back in her hometown in Georgia, she and her cousin used to blow bubbles with nothing but cheap soap and a chipped ceramic cup. The sky would glitter as those fragile orbs floated in sunlight, and the neighborhood kids would chase them, laughing until hunger and sunburns were forgotten. The thought tightened her chest. Could something so small matter here? She glanced again at Miles. He still sat there, hollow-eyed, hands clenched between his knees. Do I even have the right to try? She wondered. The rule was clear, but surely one bubble couldn't hurt. Grace drew a deep breath. Her fingers dipped into the soapy water, pulling out a thin, glistening film. She lifted it to her lips and blew. A bubble emerged round, transparent, capturing both the sunlight and the drifting cherry petals. It wavered upward, fragile and free. Grace didn't dare look at Miles. Her eyes stayed on the bubble, as though her own unspoken prayer floated within it. And then the miracle. From the corner of her vision, she saw it. Miles lifted his head. For the first time in 16 months, his dark eyes shifted from the ground, wide and startled, catching the bubble's shimmer. A faint light sparked there. His hand reached up, almost hesitant. The bubble touched his fingertip, then burst, sprinkling droplets that clung like diamonds to his skin. Miles froze. Then the corners of his lips curled into a smile, not forced, not fleeting, but a real smile, the first since his mother's death. Grace's breath caught. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might break. She clenched her other fist, fighting the sting of tears. The boy had smiled over a single fragile bubble. She whispered, voice trembling, "Thank you, God." What seemed so meaningless had just torn down a wall of silence that neither power, nor money, nor the finest therapists could breach. On the mansion's 3rd floor, where sunlight fractured through towering glass panes, Jonathan Whitmore sat in his office. His walnut desk was buried under glowing spreadsheets and contracts worth billions. Beside him sat his 3rd, untouched espresso of the morning, long gone cold. Jonathan Whitmore, 38, self-made billionaire, praised across Wall Street for turning risk into reward. Yet inside his own home, he had been powerless for more than a year. Powerless before the silence of his only child. A blinking red icon flashed across his monitor. The security system had triggered a camera in the garden. Jonathan almost ignored it. Nothing ever appeared but swaying cherry branches. But something urged him to click. The sight froze his blood. Miles, his silent, distant son, was looking up. His eyes, once dull, now lit with a spark as he followed a shimmering bubble through the air. And then his lips curved upward. A smile. Jonathan shot to his feet, gripping the desk so hard his knuckles whitened. His body trembled. He smiled. He replayed the clip again and again. There was no denying it. The boy smiled, and the cause was her, Grace Ellis, the housemaid he had never paid attention to, the woman he thought existed only to scrub floors and vanish from sight. Through the camera lens, he saw her bend again, blowing another bubble, and once more, Miles looked up, eyes bright, as if the sun itself had touched him. A storm of emotions struck Jonathan: shock, disbelief, and yes, even jealousy. He had spent hundreds of thousands on the best specialists, only to fail, and with nothing but soap and silence, she had done what his money could not. Jonathan braced both hands on the desk, head bowed low, his jaw tightened, every muscle in his face trembling. For the first time in months, hope flickered, and it terrified him. "Why her?" he whispered hoarsely. In the garden, the bubble burst into light, but inside Jonathan's chest, something deeper cracked a fracture in the glass wall he had built around himself. For the first time, the man who controlled everything realized how helpless he truly was. That night, under cherry blossoms and fading sunlight, 3 lives, an untouchable CEO, a boy locked in silence, and a woman invisible to the world, had been tied together by something as fragile as a bubble. And though one breath could shatter it, it was, perhaps, a beginning. Part 2. The gaze from the window. The 3rd-floor office of the Whitmore estate was always flooded with cold light. Towering panes of glass stretched from floor to ceiling, casting reflections across a wide walnut desk where Jonathan Whitmore spent nearly every waking hour. 3 flat screens blinked with market charts, reports stacked in neat piles. The territory of a man who ran a global empire where every decision he made could shake Wall Street itself. But today, Jonathan wasn't watching numbers. His eyes kept drifting toward the small monitor on the right, where the garden security feed played. On that screen, a scene unfolded. Grace, the maid he had barely noticed until now, crouched beneath a cherry tree, blowing soap bubbles into the sunlight, and Miles, his 5-year-old son, the boy who had been silent for 16 long months, was looking up at the floating orb, his lips lifting into a fragile smile. Jonathan's heart seemed to stop. He lunged closer to the monitor, replaying the footage. Once, twice. Each time the image was the same. His son was smiling. Not a dream, not an illusion. A true smile, small, fleeting, but brighter than every chandelier in this house. His chest tightened. How many nights had he stood outside Miles's door, begging the silence for a sound, a word, any sign of life? How many specialists had he paid, only to watch them leave with empty hands? And now, this unknown woman, with nothing but a soap bubble, had reached his son's heart. Jonathan whispered, his voice trembling like it never had before. "My boy." You finally smiled, yet almost instantly, the awe twisted into something else. Jealousy, confusion, even fear. He, Jonathan Whitmore, the master strategist, the man hailed as untouchable, was powerless before the fragile soul of his child, leaning on his desk, head bowed. He felt his pulse racing. He wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, as simple fascination with light, but the way Miles's eyes sought Grace, it wasn't random. It was connection. Jonathan clenched his fist, veins rising against his skin. The truth pierced him like a blade. He was not the first to break his son's silence. Below, Grace kept going. Another bubble drifted upward, scattering into droplets as it touched Miles's hand, and then soft, almost like laughter. Miles made a sound. Jonathan pressed a hand to his chest. It had been so long since he felt this kind of hope, and yet that hope cut deep. Why hadn't he been able to do this? Tears blurred his vision as he stared at the screen, The powerful CEO, who ruled everything beyond these walls, now wept like a broken man inside them. Jealousy and gratitude clashed inside him until he felt hollow, undone. The smile of his son repeated in his mind, delicate as glass, ready to shatter at any moment. Jonathan pressed his forehead to the window pane, breathing hard. In his world, everything had rules, data, measurable outcomes. But how could he measure this? It can't be, he muttered. It can't just be bubbles. Yet no argument could silence the truth his heart already knew. Fear crept in. Fear of no longer being the center of his son's world. Fear that his boy no longer needed him. Jonathan Whitmore, billionaire, leader, power broker, reduced to a father, trembling at the thought of being replaced. No, he growled under his breath. I'm his father. Nothing can change that. But when his gaze fell back to the screen, where Miles's eyes glowed as bright as the sun, Jonathan's defenses collapsed. He hadn't seen his son alive like this in so long. He staggered back, gripping the edge of his chair. A war raged inside him. One voice demanding he call the staff. Stop, Grace. Restore control. The other voice begging him to let the moment continue. For the first time, he was paralyzed. The man who always knew what to do didn't. Oh, God, he whispered. I don't know what to do anymore. And then it came from the garden. Faint but clear a laugh. Miles's laugh? Fragile, thin, but real. It pierced the cold walls, echoing into Jonathan's chest. He froze. His eyes burned with tears. And then, for the first time in 16 months, Jonathan let out a trembling laugh of his own. Keep laughing, Miles, he whispered through tears. Daddy needs to hear you laugh again. That night, the mighty CEO surrendered to the truth. His son's smile had destroyed every rule he lived by. Days passed, and Jonathan's rigid schedule began to unravel. Each morning, instead of diving into reports and global calls, he lingered at the monitor, watching the garden, watching Grace, patient and silent, blowing bubbles, watching Miles, his eyes alight, following each one as if it carried magic. Jonathan found himself studying every gesture, the tilt of Miles's head, the faint movement of his lips, the little sound half giggle, half sigh that slipped free. A year's worth of desperate longing now unfolding without him. One morning, Grace blew 3 bubbles in a row. Miles lifted 3 tiny fingers, waiting for her to continue. She smiled softly, humoring him. Jonathan's throat burned. This wasn't coincidence anymore. It was a language, a game of their own, a bond he wasn't part of. Why don't you look at Daddy? He whispered hoarsely to the screen. Why her? That night, he replayed the recordings again and again. Each smile, each gesture was a dagger and a gift. He was addicted to hope, even if it came through her hands. During a board meeting, when asked about an Asian expansion project, Jonathan paused, something unheard of. For in that moment, his mind wasn't on numbers. It was on a bubble rising through the sun, and his son's laughter beneath it. He knew, finally, how much he had lost while chasing control. And then, the miracle. That afternoon, Jonathan stood in the hallway, gazing through the tall windows that overlooked the garden. No camera this time, just his own eyes. Grace sat on the grass, her brown hair tied back, small yet steady. Miles sat cross-legged before her, watching another bubble dissolve in his palm. Sunlight lit his boy's face. Jonathan saw every detail, the focus in his eyes, the curve of his smile. And then, Miles looked up at the sky. His lips trembled, and after 16 months of silence, he whispered, "Sky." Jonathan's knees buckled. His hand gripped the window ledge. Tears spilled hot and unstoppable. "My son! You spoke. Oh, God. You spoke." Down below, Grace didn't cheer, didn't shout. She only placed a hand to her chest. her eyes shining, as if holding the sacred moment within her. Jonathan stood frozen. For all his billions, all his power, he was speechless, because this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Miles and to Grace. Something cracked open in him, wide and raw. He could no longer stay still. He moved, step by step, down the wide staircase, his footsteps echoing through the silent hall. When he pushed open the glass doors, spring air rushed in, carrying cherry blossoms and the faint scent of soap. Grace looked up. Startled, she held the plastic bubble wand, droplets still clinging to its edge. Her face glowed in the sunlight, hesitant, waiting for his words. Miles didn't notice the tension. He only smiled at Grace, his joy reserved for her. Jonathan's heart twisted. Miles, he rasped. The boy turned. For a split second, their eyes met, and Jonathan's whole world broke open. But then, Miles turned back to Grace, still smiling. Jonathan swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he faced her. How did you do this? Grace shook her head softly. Her hand tightened around the bubble wand. I didn't do anything, Mr. Whitmore. I just sat here and waited. Two simple words. Yet Jonathan knew he had never once done that. He had thrown money, demanded answers, but never truly waited with his son. He stood there, undone, stripped of every title, not a CEO, not a master of the market, just a father lost. Miles suddenly reached up. Jonathan instinctively extended his hand, but the boy grasped Grace's finger instead. Jonathan froze, and then Miles turned, his lips trembling once more. Sky, time stopped. Jonathan's tears fell freely, but he didn't look away. His gaze lifted, following the last bubble as it floated upward into the golden sun, carrying, perhaps, the fragile hope of a new beginning. For the first time, the three of them, child, Maid, father, stood together, bound by a bubble, by a word, by the thin thread of something more powerful than control. Part 3. The Language of Silence. Mornings in the Whitmore garden slowly became a rhythm strange at first, but comforting. The first light of day poured through the cherry blossoms, painting the grass in soft shades of pink and gold. And in the same corner of the garden, two small figures sat quietly side by side. Grace, in her simple beige cotton dress, and Miles, the wide-eyed boy whose silence carried more weight than words. No one spoke. There were no conversations, no coaxing, only a small plastic wand, a bottle of soap water, and bubbles fragile, gleaming, drifting upward until they burst in the morning breeze. Jonathan had grown used to the sight. Each morning, with steam still curling from his coffee, he would pause at the great dining room window before heading to work. He'd watch his son, the boy who had locked himself in silence for 16 months, begin to open again, piece by piece, through a language without words. For so long, Jonathan had believed healing would come from breakthroughs, the right therapies, the right interventions, maybe even shock strong enough to pull Miles back. But now, he saw the opposite was true. It was patience. It was silence. It was the fragile gift of bubbles that had touched his son's soul. One morning, Miles reached out. A bubble landed on his fingertip and burst, leaving tiny droplets. The boy's eyes lit with a smile not on his lips, but in his gaze. Jonathan gasped, his coffee cup rattling against the table. His hands trembled. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "My son, he's coming back." Grace tilted her head, smiling softly at the boy. No words passed between them, but Jonathan saw it clearly, a bond of understanding. Two souls scarred in different ways, yet finding one another in silence. From above, the man who once ruled everything felt, for the first time, like he was no longer at the center, and strangely, it eased him, as if the weight he had carried alone was finally being shared. That night, returning late, Jonathan paused at Miles's bedroom door. The boy slept soundly, his breath steady. On the bedside table lay the small bubble wand Grace had left behind. Jonathan stared at it for a long time, then whispered softly into the dark, "Thank you, Grace, thank you for being here." For the first time, he understood. It wasn't words that had opened his son's heart. It was Grace's gentle silence. That silent smile from Miles had nearly brought the powerful CEO to his knees. The next morning, Jonathan did not stand behind the window as usual. He walked straight into the garden, a cup of coffee in hand, trying to look casual, as though passing through. But inside, his heart raced, nervous, like a young man on his first day in the boardroom. Miles sat cross-legged in the grass, touching the soap bottle, eyes following Grace's slow bubbles. When they burst, he smiled faintly. Jonathan's chest ached at the sight. He longed to be part of it. He lowered himself onto the grass, not too close. Setting the cup aside, he reached for one of the spare wands. Grace froze briefly, her eyes lifting to his surprised, uncertain. Jonathan drew in a breath, dipped the wand, and blew. A single bubble floated upward, rainbow light shimmering in its curve. For a moment, he believed Miles would look at him, smile at him, but no. The boy tilted his head, watched briefly, then turned back to Grace, waiting for her to blow the next one. The smile returned, but not for Jonathan. His hand trembled. The wand slipped, landing in the grass. Grace touched his hand lightly, her voice soft, as if afraid to break the fragile air. "Don't rush." He's still learning to trust. Time is all he needs. Jonathan lifted his gaze to hers, eyes burning with pain and gratitude. He wanted to protest, to demand recognition as the father, but the words stuck in his throat. Because she was right. He had never been patient, never just waited. Miles giggled softly when Grace blew another bubble. That tiny laugh pierced Jonathan like a knife, but also healed him like medicine. He let the tears come, unhidden, watching his son's light return. In that moment, the once invincible CEO whispered only to himself, "My boy, Daddy will start over. I'll learn to be silent, too." To listen. That night, the Whitmore mansion lay in silence. On the top floor, Jonathan's office still glowed, but instead of towers of files or glowing spreadsheets, the desk held a small blue bubble kit. Jonathan sat alone, wand in hand, lips pressed tight. He blew. The bubble popped instantly, splattering drops across his notes. He frowned, tried again. This one sagged, misshapen, and fell to the floor. Before bursting, he froze. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed a low, bitter sound. Placing the wand down, he pressed his hands to his face, and then the shoulders of the man, once feared, across Wall Street, shook. Grace, passing the hallway with a folded cloth, stopped. She peeked through the half-open door, and there he was, not the cold, untouchable CEO, but a father, clumsy, broken, crying quietly over soap bubbles. "Son," his voice cracked, unaware anyone was listening. "Daddy doesn't know how to do this right, but I won't stop trying. Please, just come back to me." Tears fell onto the wand, mixing with the soap. Grace pressed a hand to her lips. She had never imagined she would see Jonathan like this, so human, so raw, not invincible, but a man desperate to love his child. And in that moment, something shifted in her heart. Not pity, but deep, aching empathy. The next morning, the garden glowed brighter than ever. Miles sat waiting in his usual spot, little hands holding the wand. But this time, Jonathan appeared too. He wasn't in a suit, just a white shirt, sleeves rolled high, and in his hand, a brand new bubble kit. Grace blinked in surprise. Their eyes met. And Jonathan gave a small nod, calm on the outside, but in his gaze was quiet resolve. He sat, keeping a respectful distance. Carefully, he poured the liquid, dipped the wand, and blew. To his relief, a perfect bubble formed round, shimmering, rising. Grace smiled. Miles watched. His eyes widened. Then, hesitantly, he glanced at Grace, as if to ask, "Did Daddy really do that?" She nodded softly. "Yes, Miles, Daddy did it." The boy hesitated. Then, for the first time, he reached out, not for Grace, but for Jonathan. His tiny hand brushed against his father's sleeve. Jonathan froze. Breath caught in his chest. A simple touch, but to him, it was a miracle. His eyes filled. Voice breaking. "Thank you, son." Grace watched, her heart swelling. It wasn't much, but it was a bridge. And then, another miracle. Grace blew a bubble. Jonathan followed. And Miles, watching, both laughed. This time, the sound came out clear. A real laugh, rusty but radiant. Jonathan dropped the wand, covering his face with both hands. Undone, Grace looked at him, and for the first time, thought he had never looked stronger than in the moment he broke. Then it happened. Miles leaned forward, resting his small head against his father's shoulder. Jonathan's whole body trembled. He gathered the boy into his arms, awkward, hesitant, but desperate. "I'm here," he whispered. "Daddy's not going anywhere." Grace sat still, tears blurring her eyes. This was the beginning of a new language, not one of words, but of presence, patience, and fragile bubbles. For the first time, three souls, an isolated billionaire, a silent child, and an invisible woman, found each other that morning beneath falling petals and rising bubbles. Miles laughed freely under the open sky. Jonathan wept openly, and Grace, watching them both, felt her own heart awaken. A family broken, fragile, but slowly being mended, was being born. Part 4, the first word, sky. That morning, the glass chamber of the Carter estate was awash with sunlight. Towering windows reached from floor to ceiling, reflecting the cherry blossom garden outside. Petals drifted through the spring air in a soft, graceful dance, scattering delicate shades of pink across the green lawn. Grace sat quietly in the corner of the room, dipping a small plastic wand into soap water. Bubbles shimmered to life round, glowing with hints of rainbow light as they rose and burst into tiny sparks of brightness. Miles sat close to the glass wall, his wide eyes following every bubble. His lips parted, still voiceless, but his gaze carried a light that had not been there before, clearer, brighter, expectant. Grace smiled and blew another bubble. This one drifted slowly, catching the blue sky in its curve. In that instant, Miles reached out and pressed his tiny hand to the glass. But his eyes were no longer fixed on the bubble. They were reaching through, staring at the endless sky beyond. He swallowed, his lips trembling, and then, so softly it almost vanished into the air, came a sound. "Pure sky." Grace froze, breath still lingering on her lips. She set the wand down with shaking hands. Surely she had imagined it. But then again, from that small mouth, "Sky." Her heart stopped. Tears surged before she could stop them. She fell to her knees beside the boy, gripping his shoulders. "Miles, sweetheart, what did you just say? Say it again. Please, say it again." The child blinked, turned to her, and for the first time in 16 months, smiled. A full, radiant smile. And then he whispered once more, clearer, surer, "Sky." Grace broke down, laughing and crying all at once. She pulled him into her arms, whispering through her sobs, "Oh, thank God. You're back. You've come back to us." "Miles." The door burst open. Jonathan stepped inside and froze. He had walked into countless boardrooms, faced storms on Wall Street without blinking. But now, He stood motionless, undone, as he heard the sound he had prayed for through endless nights. Miles. His voice cracked, fragile as if he were speaking his son's name for the first time. The boy lifted his gaze. Blue eyes met his father's. Then Miles raised a small finger toward the sky outside and repeated firmly, his voice trembling but true. Sky! Jonathan could not hold back. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees, wrapping his son into his arms. And for the first time in years, tears fell freely down his face, dampening the boy's hair. Thank you, God. Thank you for giving me back his voice, he whispered. Grace remained beside them, her hand still on Miles's back, watching in silence. She realized this was not just a child's first word. It was the unlocking of a father's heart. It was the rebirth of a family. The moment was both miracle and wound. A miracle because Miles had spoken. A wound because Jonathan finally saw how long he had kept himself and his son behind walls of glass. Miles pointed again, repeating with more strength, Sky. Jonathan's chest tightened. He turned toward the towering panes of glass. For years, they had stood like invisible prison bars, separating him and his boy from the world outside. And he knew it was he who had built those walls. Without hesitation, Jonathan pressed a button. With a low rumble, the massive glass doors slid open. Spring air rushed in, carrying the scent of blossoms and damp grass. If you want the sky, Jonathan said, his voice breaking, then the sky will be yours. Miles froze, wide-eyed. For a moment he hesitated, then, clutching Grace's hand, he stepped forward. The breeze touched his face, his hair lifted, his small chest rose with a deep, trembling breath, and then, before both Grace and Jonathan, the boy laughed, a real laugh, clear, innocent, and so pure, it seemed the entire garden stopped to listen. Jonathan crumbled at the sound. He fell at the threshold, covering his face, laughing and crying at once. My boy, my son is back. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, tears streaming. She knew she was witnessing the birth of something far greater than healing. This was resurrection. The wind swept petals through the garden, a pink rain under golden sunlight. Miles spread his arms wide, laughing, letting blossoms fall on his shoulders, his hair, his tiny palms. Grace stepped behind, blowing more bubbles into the air. They floated upward, catching sunlight, blending with the blossoms, turning the sky into a canvas of magic. Bubbles and sky, she whispered. Miles giggled, chasing them. His voice rang out, high and bright. Sky. Jonathan staggered to his feet, heart racing. He stepped down into the grass, slow and careful, as if afraid the moment might vanish. He knelt, opening his arms. No words, only a father waiting. Miles paused. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, he ran. His little feet pattered across the grass, laughter trailing behind. He hurled himself into his father's arms. Jonathan caught him, holding him so tightly it was as if he could keep the entire world safe within that embrace. Tears streamed down his face, but his voice was steady. Daddy's here. Daddy's not going anywhere. Grace stood back, both hands covering her mouth, her tears falling freely. She had prayed for this moment, and here it was. A boy who had broken silence, a man who had broken walls, a family born again through a single word. Sky, Miles shouted once more, his voice ringing like music beneath the blossoms. Jonathan looked up, his eyes meeting Grace's, no longer the cold CEO, but a man undone, humbled, grateful. Grace, he said softly, voice thick with emotion. Thank you. You gave me back my son, and you gave me back myself. Grace shook her head, whispering through tears. No, sir. It was Miles. He chose to come back when his heart was ready. But in her eyes, he saw the truth. She had been the bridge. And so, under a shower of blossoms and bubbles, the three of them laughed together, no longer CEO, maid, and boy, just a man, a woman, and a child reborn beneath the spring sky. Part 5. Forced to leave. The top floor office of the Whitmore Corporation stood silent, like a fortress made of glass. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, the morning light glinting across the towering windows. Yet inside, the air was so heavy it felt like even a single breath echoed like a drumbeat in one's chest. Jonathan sat behind his massive walnut desk, his navy suit crisp, his face a mask of cold detachment. Across from him, 5 board members sat in a line, their expressions stern, their voices sharp each word like a blade aimed straight at him. Jonathan, the silver-haired chairman, leaned forward, his tone cutting. "We've heard enough. You cannot allow an unvetted maid to come near your son or your private life. This is a risk not only to the Whitmore family's reputation, but also to the company itself." Another board member, a woman with razor-sharp eyes, added coldly, "That child is already fragile. Allowing an outsider with no medical or psychological expertise to interfere is irresponsible. We demand that you put an end to this at once. Fire, Grace." The air froze. Jonathan remained silent, his deep eyes fixed on the glass wall. Sunlight poured across his face, but it could not erase the storm darkening his gaze. At last, his voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "Have any of you ever seen my son smile?" The room fell utterly still. Jonathan lifted his head, his eyes burning fiercely as he pressed each word into the air like an unshakable truth. "For 16 months, Miles has been silent. Not a word, not a single smile. I took him to hospitals, to specialists, spent millions of dollars, and yet, within days of being with Grace, my son laughed. He spoke his very first word." One director scoffed, shaking his head. "A coincidence. You cannot allow some poor, uneducated woman to destabilize this corporation." Jonathan's fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. 2 worlds collided violently within him. The logic of a CEO safeguarding his empire, and the fragile heart of a father who had just heard his child's laughter. He wanted to shout that they understood nothing, that what they called danger was the only miracle his family had. But instead, he swallowed his fury, lips pressed tight. And then came the memory, Miles whispering sky. It pierced him like a blade. Jonathan knew if Grace left, that sky would collapse and his boy would be lost again in the dark. He drew in a breath, his voice firm but trembling. "You are asking me to choose between the company and my son." The chairman's reply was ice. "No, we are asking you to choose between weakness and responsibility. And Jonathan, you know which must come first." Something inside him cracked. His hand tightened until blood welled, but his face remained still. He knew this battle would not end easily. That afternoon, Jonathan summoned Grace. She stepped in quietly, her simple beige blouse carrying the faint scent of soap and garden flowers. She smiled softly, her eyes still shimmering with the memory of Miles's laughter that morning. But the smile faded as soon as she saw Jonathan slumped in his chair, shoulders heavy, face pale with exhaustion. "You asked for me." Her voice trembled. Jonathan lifted his gaze, eyes swirling with anger, helplessness, and sorrow. His words came hoarse. "The board wants you gone." Grace froze. Her hands dropped, fingers twisting nervously. "Gone. Immediately." Jonathan cut in, his voice weighed down like lead. He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. The silence was suffocating. The clock ticked loudly, each second carving into her heart. Grace swallowed hard, tears glistening in her eyes. Everything that had bloomed, the laughter, the whispered sky. The bubbles floating toward heaven vanished in an instant. Her voice quivered, but she held steady. But Miles, he needs me. Jonathan closed his eyes, his hand tapping the desk as though holding himself together. His whisper was almost broken. I know. For the first time, she saw him not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man shackled by invisible chains, chains named duty, honor, empire. What will you tell Miles? She whispered. Jonathan's bloodshot eyes lifted, raw, with pain. I don't know, but I cannot lose him again. And his fists shook. They're threatening that. Grace's tears fell silently. Jonathan's lips parted, as if to speak words he could not bring himself to say. Instead, his voice cracked with just 4. I'm sorry, Grace. The moment hung heavy, and then small footsteps in the hall. The door creaked open. Miles peeked inside, his blue eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Sky, he whispered. Both Jonathan and Grace froze. Her heart shattered, just as she was about to be taken from him. Later that day, Grace was brought before the board. The oak-paneled conference room glimmered cold beneath a crystal chandelier. The chairman slid a termination letter toward her, his tone flat. Grace Miller, this is your release. Please sign and leave the estate today. Her hands trembled. The paper blurred through her tears. She thought of Miles, the light in his eyes, his fragile voice whispering sky. But the boy needs me, she pleaded softly. A board member scoffed. Sharp as glass. The boy needs a specialist, not a maid. Sign it. Grace's tears spilled as she picked up the pen, her hand shaking. But before ink touched paper, the door burst open. Mommy! The cry cut through the room like thunder. Everyone turned. Miles stood in the doorway, his little body shaking, cheeks streaked with tears. Jonathan was right behind him, too late to stop him. Don't leave me. Mommy, Miles sobbed, arms reaching desperately toward Grace. His voice cracked the silence, tearing down the icy walls that had surrounded this room of power for decades. Gasps filled the boardroom. 16 months of silence broken by the word mommy. Grace dropped the pen, her hands flying to her mouth. Jonathan rushed forward, scooping up his son. But Miles writhed in his arms, crying harder. Mommy! Sky! Don't go. The boardroom, once a place of ruthless deals and polished power, was undone by the raw, innocent cry of a child. Tears streamed down Miles's cheeks, and every cold argument the board had prepared crumbled to dust. Jonathan's voice roared, trembling with fury and love. You see, my son just spoke for the first time in 16 months, and he spoke to her, to the woman you want gone. Silence. No rebuttal came. Jonathan rose, setting his son down gently, his tall frame towering as he slammed his palm against the oak table. Enough. You've just witnessed it yourselves. Grace is the only bridge bringing my boy back, and I will not let you destroy that. One director tried weakly. Jonathan, you're the CEO. You cannot let personal feelings ruin the company's image. Imagine the headlines. A maid becomes the heir's savior. Hey? Jonathan's laugh was bitter, sharp. Headlines. Or is it your control? You're afraid of losing. Tell me how many of you have spent even 1 hour, just one, trying to understand the boy who lost his mother. None. Not one. And I will not let you tear away the fragile joy my son has just found. The room went tense, a battle of wills, pressing like steel. A voice snapped. You forget the CEO serves at the board's will. Defy us, and your seat may not last. Jonathan lifted his head high, his eyes blazing like fire, his voice like thunder. Then take the seat. Strip me of it. I can lose a title, a company, an empire, but my son, I cannot lose, and no one, not even you, will take this hope from him. The words struck like iron, Silence spread. Grace clutched her chest, her heart pounding wildly. For the first time, she saw Jonathan not as the distant CEO, but as a father, one willing to burn a throne to protect his child. And to protect her, Miles reached out again, his little voice breaking through with desperate love. "Mommy." "Sky." The room stood still. The board members, so used to dealing in numbers and power, faltered at the sight of a child's tears. Finally, the chairman's gravelly voice cut the air. "Very well. If you choose this path, Jonathan, you will pay the price." But Jonathan did not flinch. He stood tall, every inch a man who had chosen not the company, not the empire, but his son, and the woman who brought him back to life. Part 6. The word bubble on stone. That morning, the garden once alive with Miles's laughter and Grace's gentle voice lay strangely silent. Pale pink cherry blossoms swayed in the breeze, petals drifting onto the polished white stone path. Yet amid the beauty lingered an emptiness, as if something precious had been stolen away. Jonathan stood at the tall living room window, a forgotten cup of coffee cooling in his hand. His eyes followed his son, who sat cross-legged on the stone. Miles was no longer running, no longer chasing bubbles through the air. Instead, he sat quietly, clutching a single blue crayon. Jonathan stepped outside, his shoes crunching softly on the gravel. He watched as Miles bent low, carefully scrawling across the stone walkway, each stroke clumsy yet determined. "What are you doing, Miles?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentler than usual. The boy didn't look up. His small shoulders trembled as he finished the last letter, then sat back to admire his work. On the white stone, uneven and shaky, stood one word: bubble. Jonathan's heart tightened. He dropped to his knees, staring at the fragile word as tears blurred his vision. He hadn't let himself cry in years, but this moment broke through the walls he'd built. Miles set down the crayon, his little fingers brushing the chalky letters. His lips moved, and with all his strength, he whispered, "Boo, bibile, Mommy Grace." Jonathan froze. His son had strung together two words for the first time, halting, imperfect, but real. Behind it lay a yearning too deep for words, the ache of missing Grace. Jonathan pulled him into his arms, holding him close, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here, Miles, but Daddy knows you miss her, just like I do." Miles pressed his face into his father's chest, silent but clinging tightly. Jonathan lifted his gaze. The word bubble blurred beneath the drifting petals, fading under the spring breeze. And in that fading word, Jonathan felt a knife twist in his chest. Grace had left a miracle behind. But would he let it slip away like fragile soap bubbles bursting in the sky? He stayed kneeling on the cold stone longer than ever before. Normally, he would have hurried past the garden, his mind filled with board reports, contracts, endless calls. But not today. Today, he could not move. Beside him, Miles still clutched the blue crayon, his damp eyes fixed on the word bubble. To him, it was a lifeline, a fragile bridge back to Grace. Jonathan sighed and reached into the scattered crayons. His hand closed on a black one, a color that mirrored his own despair. Slowly, heavily, he bent down and began to write. Miles tilted his head, watching silently. When Jonathan finished, another word stood beside his son's. "Stay," he whispered, almost to himself. "I wish you had stayed, Grace." Miles didn't understand everything, but his tiny finger reached out to trace the new word. He looked up at his father, eyes questioning. Why couldn't she stay? Jonathan had no answer. He only held his boy tighter. In his mind rose the image of Grace, her small figure glowing in sunlight. Her laugh soft as bubbles rose into the sky. A breeze swept through, carrying petals onto the two words bubble and stay. Jonathan's throat tightened. Even nature seemed to etch their loss into stone. He bent low, murmuring into his son's hair. Son, Daddy promises. Stay won't just be a wish. One day, we'll bring Grace back. Miles didn't speak. He only nodded slowly, then placed the blue crayon into his father's hand. That small gesture shattered Jonathan's heart. It was as if his child, though still so little, was entrusting him with the same longing. Together, their two words lay side by side on the stone fragile letters carrying the weight of love and loss. That afternoon, under the amber light of sunset, Miles sat beneath the largest cherry tree. He opened his crayon box, reaching instantly for the familiar blue, the color Grace had once used to draw bubbles just for him. Alone, without guidance or encouragement, he began to draw circles, large, small, overlapping, crooked. But every one of them rose upward, as if chasing the sky. From the window, Jonathan watched. He saw the sweat bead on his son's forehead, the shaky determination in each line, and then he saw it. Inside one of the largest circles, Miles carefully wrote a word. His letters wavered, but they were clear. Grace. Jonathan's breath caught. He stepped forward, his footsteps crunching softly as he neared. When he knelt, he saw even more beside Grace. The boy had scrawled another word, bubble. Son, Jonathan's voice cracked. This is Grace, isn't it? Miles looked up, eyes brighter than they'd been in months. He didn't speak, only nodded fiercely, pressing his hand to the letters. Jonathan gathered him into his arms, whispering, I understand now. To you, Grace isn't just a maid. She's laughter. She's hope. She's the bridge that carries you back to the world. Miles clung tightly, his fist gripping the crayon as though it was the last thread to Grace. And Jonathan knew no report, no contract, no demand from the board mattered anymore. Only this did. Lifting his gaze to the sky, Jonathan whispered, not as a CEO, but as a broken man, aching for what was lost. Grace, if you can hear me, come back. Miles needs you, and so do I. That night, the mansion was hushed. Jonathan sat at his desk, papers piled high but unread. His mind replayed the sight of that blue circle, the shaky letters spelling Grace. He opened his laptop. The board's emails filled the screen. She is a risk. She threatens the company's image. Without her, everything will run smoothly. His fist clenched. And what about my son? What about his first laugh in 16 months? The thought drove him from his desk to the liquor cabinet. Yet instead of pouring whiskey, he stood motionless, staring at his reflection in the glass. A man praised as cold, decisive, ruthless, undone by a single word. Grace? A knock came at the door. Miles, in blue pajamas, carrying the crayon box, silently. He set it on the desk, his eyes steady. Jonathan bent down, his voice low. What do you want Daddy to do? Miles opened the box, placed the blue crayon in his father's palm, and then, with all the strength he had, he whispered a single word, find. Jonathan collapsed to his knees, pulling his son close. His body shook with emotion. That word his boy's first, since Sky was not just progress, it was a command. Find Grace. He pressed his lips to his son's hair, whispering through tears, Daddy promises, I'll find her. For you, for us, that night. Jonathan dialed a trusted friend, a private lawyer. I need everything you can gather on Grace Ellis. Address, work, anything. Keep it secret. The board must never know. Jonathan, came the hesitant reply. This could cost you your career. Are you sure? His answer was steady, trembling only with truth. My career is worth nothing compared to my son's smile. The next morning, gray skies hung low. Jonathan slipped into a plain black SUV, avoiding his usual limousine. In his hands was a thin file, Grace's trail leading to a small bakery on the outskirts of New Haven. His heart raced as he drove. He imagined her in a simple apron, dusted with flour, her hands shaping bread, unaware that somewhere else a boy was writing her name on stone. When the bell above the bakery door chimed, Jonathan stepped inside. The air smelled of butter and sugar, warm and sweet. Sunlight poured across trays of golden pastries. But behind the counter, Grace was not there. A young woman looked up, smiling politely. "Hello, sir. What can I get you today?" Jonathan's voice faltered. I'm looking for someone. Grace Ellis. She used to work here, didn't she? The girl's smile softened with sympathy. "Oh, Grace, she was here for a while, but she left, moved farther away. I think, maybe, to escape something." Jonathan stood still, the words slicing through him. His hand gripped the folder tight, but his hope slipped like sand through his fingers. Without a word, he turned and left. Outside, clouds pressed heavy over the sky. The smell of bread lingered behind him, like a memory already out of reach. Inside the car, he leaned against the wheel, tears finally spilling. The image of Miles writing Grace beneath the cherry tree burned in his mind, and in a whisper, half vow, half prayer, he said, "I'll find you, Grace, whatever it takes." Part 7. The Father Who Learned to Blow Bubbles. The villa's garden was quiet that morning. Cherry blossoms drifted lazily through the air, landing on the cold stone path and on the gray shoulders of Jonathan's tailored suit. But unlike every other morning, he didn't head straight for the waiting car. Instead, he lingered at the porch, his eyes fixed on a familiar corner of the garden. There sat Miles, clutching his worn crayon box. In front of him, the faded blue circles still remained on the stone. The shaky word, bubble, scrawled days before. Beside him now rested a clear plastic bottle, its liquid glistening inside the same solution Grace once used. Jonathan descended the steps slowly. For the first time, he wasn't CEO of Whitmore Group, not the Iron Man respected and feared in boardrooms. He was only a father desperate to touch his son's heart. He sat beside Miles, uncaring that the expensive suit picked up dirt. Taking the little bottle in hand, he turned it awkwardly, like a boy learning something new. "Can Daddy try?" he asked softly. Miles looked up, his wide blue eyes startled, uncertain. He didn't speak, but quietly placed the small orange bubble wand into his father's hand. Jonathan dipped it into the solution, drew a deep breath, and blew. A dry pft burst from his lips. Nothing. Only a splash of soapy water landed across his Armani tie. Miles giggled. It was brief, but clear a sound Jonathan had waited 16 months to hear. He froze, stunned, then broke into laughter himself. Awkward, almost boyish. He tried again. This time, he blew too gently. A tiny, lopsided bubble floated an inch, then popped. Miles tilted his head, lips curling into a smile. He took the wand back, dipped it, and blew. A cluster of shimmering bubbles rose, catching the morning sun, scattering rainbow fragments into the sky. Jonathan stared, mesmerized. In that moment, he understood why Grace had chosen bubbles. They were simple, fleeting, yet carried joy that nothing else could. He turned to his son, voice tender. "Teach Daddy. Daddy's not as good as you." For the first time, Miles placed his little hand over his father's, guiding the movement. Jonathan felt it warm, trembling, but full of trust. He blew again. A single bubble swelled, round and luminous, glimmering violet and rose as it floated upward, rising past the cherry trees into open sky. Miles's eyes widened. He clapped and whispered, "Daddy, Jonathan went still. Just one word, yet it broke every wall he had built. Laughter spilled from him, and with it, tears he hadn't shed in years, now shining in the morning light. That clumsy attempt, crowned by his son's first joyful daddy, marked the moment Jonathan became more than a provider. For the first time, he was truly a father. The garden, once solemn, transformed into a fairy tale world, hundreds of bubbles floating like tiny rainbows. Jonathan's expensive vest lay forgotten on the grass. His white shirt clung damp and wrinkled, hair tousled, his hands sticky with soap. And yet, his face glowed brighter than any boardroom victory. Miles nestled close, pushing a yellow wand into his hand. "Daddy, more." Jonathan smiled softly. "All right, let's fill the whole sky together." They blew, bubble after bubble, until the air shimmered with them. Some clung to cherry blossoms, scattering prismatic light. Others soared, free as birds. Jonathan looked upward, chest swelling. For the first time in years, his son's smile was effortless, unforced, genuine. "Miles," he said hoarsely, "Daddy used to think bubbles were just a child's toy. But today, Daddy sees it. Sometimes, the most fragile things carry the greatest power to heal." Miles leaned against his shoulder, pointing at a single bubble drifting higher than all the rest. "Sky," he whispered. The word pierced Jonathan's heart. His arms wrapped tight around his boy. He understood now. Power and fortune had blinded him for too long. A bubble, a fleeting shimmer of light, had brought back his son's voice, his laughter, his hope. "Daddy won't let you lose this," Jonathan murmured. "Even if I have to find grace, no matter the cost." That afternoon, sunlight turned golden, scattering soft rays across the grass. Bubbles shimmered like stardust before they burst. Jonathan lay back on the lawn, sleeves rolled, vest discarded. Miles curled beside him, his face peaceful as he watched bubbles drift into the sky. For a long time, Jonathan was silent. Then, his voice low, he confessed, "You know, son, Daddy never had a childhood like yours. Your grandfather didn't believe in play. He believed in numbers, contracts, and I had to learn how to smile at strangers instead of laughing freely, like you did just now." Miles didn't speak, but his small hand reached out and squeezed his father's. Jonathan looked down, voice breaking. "All I ever wanted was one bubble, just to laugh, but I never had it. And I was afraid you'd grow up in silence, too." Like a shadow, the name slipped from him, soft and aching. "Grace, she gave us what I thought was impossible. She gave you laughter, and me, hope. But I let her go." Miles tugged his hand, pressed it against his tiny chest. Then he pointed upward, at the single bubble that had flown highest, glowing in the sun. "Sky," he whispered again. Jonathan closed his eyes. That word knife and balm in one. He knew then, if he kept living like his father, bound in cold control, he would lose everything that mattered. "Daddy promises," he whispered into the quiet garden. "I'll be different. I'll hold on to these bubbles. I'll never let you fall silent again." Miles didn't reply. He only rested his head against Jonathan's shoulder, his small hand gripping tightly. And in that moment, Jonathan felt it. The quiet triumph of a man once thought unbreakable, now reborn through the simplest joy, by sharing his own lost childhood. Jonathan opened the door, and Miles, with a whispered sky in a trembling hand, showed him the way forward. The next morning dawned fresh and golden, mist clinging to the grass. Jonathan walked into the garden not with his briefcase, but carrying a small package. Inside was a brand new bubble set, its wand shaped like a star. Miles's eyes widened as Jonathan knelt beside him. "Yesterday," Daddy promised. "Didn't I?" Today, we'll blow bubbles together. His first attempt splattered soapy water across his shirt. Miles laughed soft, pure, and unguarded. Jonathan froze at the sound, a single laugh that filled his soul. He tried again. This time, a perfect bubble rose. Miles chased it, squealing with joy. Jonathan's heart soared. For the first time, a victory wasn't measured in billions, but in a child's laughter, and as father and son filled the garden with fragile spheres of light, Jonathan whispered, a vow not to the board, not to the world, but to his boy. From today, I'll learn to play with you, not just work for you. The distance between them, once so wide, began to close. Bubble by bubble, laugh by laugh, the sun tilted low, painting the far end of the garden in amber light. Shadows of the cherry trees stretched long and soft across the grass. Jonathan sat with his back against the trunk, his white shirt stained, his tie long abandoned and draped carelessly on the stone steps. Beside him, Miles leaned his small head against his father's shoulder, clutching the star-shaped bubble wand tightly in his hand. Before them, the sky deepened into shades of gold. Bubbles drifted slowly upward, catching the fading sunlight, shimmering with colors that seemed to dissolve into the heavens. There were no car horns, no echo of boardroom debates, only the soft laughter of a child and the steady, quiet breathing of a man learning to let go. Jonathan tilted his head, voice dropping low. You know, son, when Daddy was your age, I never had bubbles to play with. Your grandpa was always busy, and Grandma, she didn't have the strength. Miles lifted his wide, innocent eyes. He didn't understand every word, but he felt the sadness in his father's voice, and his own face grew serious. Jonathan gave a wistful smile, tracing shapes in the air, as though blowing memories instead of bubbles. All I wished back then was for someone to sit beside me and blow bubbles. And now, I have you. His voice broke. A breeze carried a bubble across their faces, drifting between them. Miles reached out instinctively, touched it with his tiny fingers, and whispered clearer than ever before, Daddy. Bubble. Jonathan froze, his heart squeezed tight. He turned, meeting his son's bright eyes, his trembling lips forming his very first complete sentence. In a rush, Jonathan gathered him close, burying his face in the boy's soft hair. At last, the tears he had held back spilled freely, soaking the little shoulder pressed against him. You just said it. You called me Daddy, and you said bubble. Do you know, Miles, that's the most beautiful sound in my life. Miles wrapped his arms around his father's neck and repeated, firmer now, as if sealing it into the world, Daddy. Bubble. The garden seemed to hold its breath. The final rays of sunlight broke into radiant streams, scattering through the hundreds of bubbles that glittered in the air. And in that fragile, shimmering moment, Jonathan understood every deal, every success, every ounce of power he had once chased meant nothing beside this. He was no longer the cold CEO of Whitmore. He was simply a father, hearing his son's true voice for the very first time. That small sentence, Daddy, bubble, had shattered the silence, breaking open both their hearts. A simple moment, yet a miracle of healing for them both. Part 8. 6 words to bring her back. The summer night was quiet, so still, you could hear the chorus of crickets weaving through the trees. Grace's small house sat tucked away in a narrow lane, worlds apart from the gleaming glass towers Jonathan had always called home. A warm yellow glow seeped through her thin curtains, soft and homely, the opposite of the cold life he had left behind. The black car idled in the driveway, its headlights dimmed to avoid curious neighbors. Jonathan sat frozen behind the wheel, his hands gripping tight. He had faced boardrooms, flashing cameras, billion-dollar deals, yet never had his heart pounded as it did now. Finally, he drew a long breath and stepped out. His shoes crunched on the gravel as he walked to the door. His hand trembled as he knocked. 3 soft raps. The door creaked open. Grace appeared thinner, her face pale, her eyes hollowed by too many sleepless nights. She flinched at the sight of him. "Jonathan," her voice cracked, carrying the weight of an unwanted memory. He swallowed hard, his voice low, stripped of authority. Raw, with plea. "Please, come back. He asked for you." Grace froze. Her hand trembled against the door frame. Memories rushed back. The garden full of bubbles, Miles's first laugh after 16 months of silence. The way he whispered sky at her side. Her chest tightened, torn between longing and fear. "You're saying—" "Miles called for me," she whispered. Jonathan nodded, eyes reddening. "Not just Grace. He said bubble, and—" "He called me Daddy." Grace's shoulders sagged. A tear slipped before she could stop it. Jonathan saw, but didn't push. He pressed on, his voice hoarse, humbled in a way he had never been. "Please, just once more, come back for him. Not for me, for Miles." The man once known as the Steel CEO stood there stripped bare, begging at a small wooden door with 6 fragile words. "Please come back. He asked for you." The night air thickened with silence. Jasmine drifted on the breeze, but inside Grace a storm raged. She kept her hand on the door, heart torn between past wounds and the memory of a boy's hand holding hers. The lamplight spilled across Jonathan's face. No trace of the proud, untouchable CEO from the papers. Remained only a man, weary-eyed, his tie undone, his shirt rumpled from the long drive. "Do you know," Grace said, voice shaking, "how many nights I tried to forget Miles's eyes when I left?" Jonathan's own eyes shut in pain, her words like knives. "I know," he whispered. "I was wrong. I let the board decide. I didn't protect you. But Miles, he hasn't forgotten. No matter what I do, I can't replace you." Her hand clenched until her nails dug into her palm. Images of Miles scribbling bubble with his blue crayon, whispering sky, flooded her mind. "I once thought I belonged in that house," she said bitterly. "But in the end, I was just an outsider. And outsiders are always pushed out." Jonathan stepped closer, voice trembling. "Not anymore. I saw him write your name on stone. I heard him whisper bubbles. Grace, if we lose you again, there won't be another chance." She breathed sharply, torn between running toward the child she loved and the fear of being broken again. Their eyes met in silence raw, pleading. Then Jonathan whispered, barely more than breath, "Please, Grace, don't punish him for my mistakes." The words shattered her last defense. A tear slipped free. She realized his plea wasn't for himself, but for their boy. The latch clicked. The door shifted. Jonathan's head snapped up. Heartbeat roaring, the dark wood opened a crack, spilling warm light onto the porch. Grace stood trembling, tears brimming, her voice hoarse. "You have 1 minute. Give me one reason why I should step back into that house." Jonathan's hand clenched. No board, no contracts, no power, only his naked heart. "Because Miles needs you. And this time, so do I." Her eyes wavered, but she held steady. He stepped half into the light, close enough to see her weary, beautiful face. "You think I don't know." He choked. For 6 weeks, he hasn't slept a full night. He doesn't cry. He doesn't scream. He just goes silent, silent, until the whole house feels orphaned. His chest shook as he whispered the words that had haunted him every day. "Grace, for 6 weeks, I've wanted to knock on your door and say only 6 words. Please come back. He asked for you." Grace's breath caught. Those 6 words echoed inside her, digging into the softest part of her soul. She turned away, shoulders shaking. Jonathan, you don't understand. If I come back, what then? Can you protect me from the board, from the eyes that will always see me as a poor girl, unworthy of your house? Jonathan's jaw tightened. The truth stung, but for once, he didn't care about their stares, their power, or their threats. He whispered like a vow, I can't silence them all, but I can promise I'll stand between you and them. I won't let anyone touch what matters most, what I almost lost. Her red-rimmed eyes lifted, colliding with his in that breathless space between them. Her voice broke. Tell me, Jonathan, do you want me back for your son? Or for you? The question hung like thunder. He drew a shuddering breath, eyes blazing with honesty. Both. Miles needs you, and so do I. Not because you're a nanny, not because you made him laugh, but because you're the missing part of the family. I was too blind to see. The door creaked wider. Grace's tears spilled, but her trembling eased. Jonathan's voice cracked as he spoke again. If you walk away now, I won't stop you, but think of Miles. He wrote Bubble on the stone. Every day, he waits just to see you. Her defenses crumbled. She saw that small boy again, clutching his crayon, scrawling her name into stone. A sob escaped. Jonathan stepped forward, not as CEO, not as a man of power, but as a father, as a man stripped bare. Please come back. He asked for you, and this time, I won't let you stand alone. The door swung open. Grace stood there, shoulders shaking, tears streaming, bathed in warm light. Jonathan's weary face glistened with his own. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then Grace stepped out, hesitant, trembling, but stepping toward him all the same. Jonathan exhaled, his eyes shining. He didn't reach for her, only whispered, Thank you. Grace's voice was raw but steady. If I return, you must prove to me your heart is stronger than your board. Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. I swear. And in that fragile, fateful moment, the cold CEO stood humbled, and the girl, who once walked away, dared to open her heart again. It was the first step back toward love, the kind that heals, the kind that changes everything. Part 9. One word to save them all. The courtroom blazed under white light, polished wood panels swallowing the heat of the noon sun. Rows of reporters crowded the benches, their pens and cameras poised like weapons, hungry for the fall of Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire CEO, who once seemed untouchable. Jonathan sat at the front. His black tailored suit gleamed, his silver-striped tie knotted with precision, yet his eyes betrayed him. No longer ice, no longer arrogance, only raw tension. His hand gripped a Mont Blanc pen so tightly it looked ready to snap, as if clinging to one last anchor of control. Across the aisle, Grace looked impossibly small, a simple pale blue dress, her hands folded in her lap, trembling despite her effort to stay composed. Here, under the suffocating gaze of power and law, she seemed like a fragile drop against an ocean of wealth. And between them sat the smallest figure of all Miles, in a white shirt too stiff for his restless shoulders, blonde hair tousled, wide eyes darting across faces too serious, voices too sharp. A boy who had not spoken for 16 months. A boy no one had ever truly listened to. The attorney for the board rose, his words slicing through the still air. Your Honor, it's simple. Who does this child feel safe with? Who made him laugh first? And should a maid, someone beneath the stature of this family, have the right to wedge herself into the bond of father and heir? The words beneath, wedge cut through Grace's heart. Her throat tightened. Jonathan shifted, his jaw clenched, fury flashing in his eyes. But even he knew his defense would sound hollow here. Words from him had no power left. Only one voice could save them. The judge leaned forward, his tone firm yet gentle. "Child, Miles Whitmore, can you tell this court who makes you feel safe?" The room froze. Silence gripped every breath. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras zoomed. Jonathan pressed his palms together like a prayer. Grace bit her lip, her pulse drumming loud enough to drown the world. Miles blinked for a heartbeat. His lips trembled. His little fingers fidgeted. Then, against all odds, he spoke one word. Fragile, trembling, yet louder than thunder. Bubbles. Time shattered. The courtroom fell into stunned stillness. The boy, who hadn't spoken in over a year, had chosen his first word, not father, not mother, but the name bound to the woman who lit his world. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling free. Jonathan's shoulders, broad enough to bear markets, shareholders, empires, shook with something he could no longer control. A single tear cut across his face. The attorney faltered, stammering. No lawyer could twist a child's truth. This was not rehearsed. This was love, innocent, unfiltered. The judge lowered his glasses, his voice softer now. "Bubbles. And who is Bubbles?" Miles turned. His smile bloomed shy but radiant as dawn. He lifted his small hand, pointing at Grace. "She makes Bubbles." The room erupted, flashbulbs, gasps, whispers, crashing like waves. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the sound of his son's fragile voice break him open. Grace sat frozen, her heart torn and healed all at once, realizing the child she loved had chosen her. The board's lawyer collapsed into silence. The case had already been decided by a single word. Jonathan stood, voice cracking, yet resolute. "Your Honor, there is no stronger evidence than that she gave my son back his voice." The judge's gavel struck once. His words carried through the chamber, heavy with meaning. This court acknowledges Grace Ellis is to remain by the child's side, protected by law from interference, for it is clear this boy's safety, his healing, lies with her. The room exploded. Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted questions. Jonathan shielded Grace and Miles with his body, his voice steady and proud. "If you want to write something, write this. She did what doctors, teachers, even I, his father, could not. She gave my son back his voice. That is the truth." An angry board member shouted about falling stocks. Jonathan turned, eyes blazing. "If being a father means losing numbers on a stock chart, then I will lose them gladly." Gasps filled the hall. In that moment, the cold CEO was gone. What stood there was only a man. Usher. He encountered a father, willing to lose everything but the two people behind him. A microphone swung toward Grace. A reporter demanded, "Why, Ms. Ellis, why did the boy call you?" "Not his father." Grace hesitated, but Miles lifted his head from her shoulder, whispering a single word, soft, yet piercing, enough for every microphone to catch. "Safe." The word echoed like a verdict written by a child. Not wealth, not blood. Safety. The judge struck his gavel 3 final times, and with that, one word had saved not just a child, not just a woman, but a family. As the heavy doors opened, flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Jonathan clasped Grace's trembling hand. Miles nestled between them, and for the first time, the billionaire did not stand as a titan of industry, but as a man redeemed by the smallest word from the smallest voice. Bubbles, a word soft as soap, strong enough to change the world. Part 10. The place opens. The Whitmore mansion, once a monument of loneliness and cold authority, now stood reborn. The towering iron gates that had always shut the world out were open wide, draped with cascades of pink and violet bougainvillea. Along the stone pathway, children's footprints crisscrossed in every direction, carried by bursts of laughter that filled the air like music. At the entrance, a wooden sign swung gently in the breeze. The place, a home for silent voices. It was less a name than a promise, a gentle invitation to anyone who had ever felt lost in the noise of the world. Grace stood on the front steps, her eyes glowing with quiet faith. In her hands, she carried a basket filled with glass jars of soap bubbles, glinting like captured rainbows beneath the sunlight. Today was more than an opening. It was a beginning, the first chapter for hearts that had once been silent. Now given permission to speak, Jonathan joined her. His suit was still impeccable, but no longer in armor. On his face rested, at last, a rare peace. He looked out toward the garden, once shaded and solemn, now transformed into a playground, alive with slides, swings, and rows of blooming cherry trees. "I never thought this house," Jonathan murmured, his voice low, trembling with something almost like awe, "could ever echo with laughter." Grace turned, her hand brushing his. Sometimes, all it takes is one bubble to light up an entire world. From the doorway, Miles bounded out in a plain white shirt, his cheeks flushed with joy. In his hand, he held his faithful green crayon, the same one that had carried him through months of silence. But today, instead of scribbling broken lines, he lifted it high like a little flag of victory. "Bubble," he shouted, his blue eyes sparkling with sunlight. Grace's breath caught, tears stinging her lashes. Jonathan pulled the boy close, whispering, "Yes, son, today, this whole place is your bubble." And with that, 100 soap bubbles soared skyward, drifting like jewels across the blue, catching the light in shimmering arcs. Around them, other children, some who had not spoken in years, lifted their small hands, reaching for hope, as if for the very first time. At that moment, a silver minivan stopped at the gate. A young mother stepped out, clutching a 6-year-old girl to her chest. The child's wide, vacant eyes gazed past the world, lost in silence. Grace walked forward, her smile tender as morning light. "Welcome," she said softly. "From today, this will be your daughter's home." The woman nodded, trembling, her eyes wet with fragile hope. She clung to her little girl's hand, as if afraid to let go of the last thread binding them. Jonathan lingered a step behind, struck by the strangeness of it all. For a man used to commanding boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, this moment felt unlike anything he'd ever known. He was no longer a CEO. He was simply a man opening his home to fragile souls. Miles sat on the steps, clutching his crayon, his gaze locked on the new girl, and in that silent stare flickered something Grace could not yet name. She knelt beside him, whispering, "Do you want to be her friend?" Miles hesitated. Then, with quiet resolve, he rose and walked over, slowly placing his precious green crayon into her trembling hands. No words, just a single crayon. The little girl blinked, her fingers quivering as she accepted it. For the first time, she looked back at him. "See," Grace whispered, tears spilling freely. "Your bubble has spread to her." Jonathan inhaled sharply, the fortress he had built around his heart crumbling under the weight of that simple exchange. Above them, bubbles rose higher, catching the two children's reflections within their fragile skin. For a heartbeat, they seemed like two lost souls, meeting in a language beyond words. That afternoon, the golden light spilled across the garden. Children explored their new world, some running beneath the cherry blossoms, some sitting quietly to draw on the stone path, others watching the bubbles with wonder, as though seeing magic for the very first time. Grace touched Jonathan's arm, her eyes bright but uncertain. "They'll need stories," she said softly. "But I don't know where to begin." Jonathan hesitated. He had spoken before investors, commanded entire markets, yet the thought of telling a simple story to children left him disarmed. Then Miles tugged his sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, story." His heart clenched. For 16 months, he had lived in silence, never hearing his son ask for anything. And now his boy wanted a story. Jonathan sat down on a wooden bench, children gathering around in a hushed circle. Grace squeezed his shoulder. A silent nudge. He drew a shaky breath. His first words cracked, unsure. "Once upon a time, there was a kingdom, very rich. The king had everything: castles, gold, power, but he could not make his little prince smile." Wide eyes locked on him. Miles leaned closer, listening. Jonathan's voice steadied, turning warm, almost lyrical. One day, a poor girl came to the palace. She carried no treasure, only a tiny glass jar of soap bubbles. She blew one bubble, and the prince laughed. For the very first time, Grace bit her lip, her heart swelling. The children leaned in, chests rising and falling with every word. The king realized then, Jonathan whispered, his throat thick, that the greatest treasure was not power or gold, but his son's laughter. And it was the poor girl who gave it to him. He faltered, the truth of his own confession hanging naked in the air. In that moment, he was no longer Jonathan Whitmore, the untouchable CEO, but a father telling his own story through the veil of a fairy tale. Miles giggled, his laughter bright and free. Another child clapped, then all the children joined in. The garden filled with the music of their voices, a symphony Jonathan had never heard within these walls. Grace leaned close, her whisper trembling, but proud. "You just tore down the tallest wall inside you." Jonathan lifted his gaze to hers, soft at last. "Stripped of storms!" Gratitude welled in his eyes, unspoken, but undeniable. The evening sun cast the garden in hues of gold. As bubbles drifted skyward, laughter rippled like a hymn through every corner of the mansion. The house was no longer a fortress of power. It was the place where hope could breathe. Miles stood on the lawn, clutching his bubble wand. He lifted his face to the sky, then turned, lips trembling with words that carried the weight of a miracle. Bubbles. Family. The world seemed to stop. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, tears cascading. Jonathan's knees nearly buckled as he seized his son's hand. What did you just say?" His voice cracked. Miles repeated, stronger now, eyes shining. "Bubbles. Family." 2 simple words, but enough to shatter years of silence. Grace fell to her knees, wrapping him in her arms. Jonathan folded himself around them both. In that embrace, there was no CEO, no maid, no lost child, only 3 hearts, beating as one. Above them, bubbles floated into the sunset, carrying laughter, carrying promises. The place was not just for Miles, it was for every fragile soul seeking a home. Grace whispered through her tears, voice steady with faith. "This isn't your mansion anymore, Jonathan. This is our home." His arms tightened around them, his voice raw but sure. "And it always will be, forever." Children's cheers mingled with clapping hands, rising like a hymn of new beginnings. And there, beneath the cherry blossoms, wrapped in bubbles and golden light, a family was born again, not by blood, not by power, but by love strong enough to speak through silence. Bubbles, family, the words that unlocked a home, a promise, and a forever. That one's for Mom. The sunset draped the garden in a soft orange glow. Dozens of rainbow-colored bubbles floated gently upward, drifting toward the wide-open sky. Miles stood in the center, his small hands tightly holding on to Grace and Jonathan. On his face was a trembling smile. and in his clear eyes shimmered the fragile universe of a childhood being given back. One single blue bubble rose higher than the rest. Miles tilted his head back, eyes following it as his lips moved, in a whisper so faint, yet clear enough for the two beside him to hear. He murmured, "That one's for Mom." Grace froze. Jonathan squeezed his son's hand tighter, his heart splintering into 100 pieces. In that moment, none of them spoke another word. Only silence lingered, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of understanding, of acceptance, of love too deep for explanation. The bubbles kept rising, each one carrying away a fragment of heavy memory, leaving behind a lightness in their hearts. For the first time, the three of them did not turn their backs to the past. Instead, they faced the present together, choosing to cherish what was here. Now, Grace turned to Jonathan, her eyes wet yet shining. "Family. Sometimes it isn't where we're born, but where we choose to stay." Jonathan nodded, his strong hand wrapping around them both, his voice rough but steady. "And I choose here, with you." With him, Miles smiled softly, squeezing their hands a little tighter before lifting his gaze again, letting the sky carry away the last of his sorrow. The three of them stood there, beneath the cherry blossoms, watching in silence as the bubbles floated higher and higher until they disappeared into the clouds. And in that silence, a new family was etched into existence, not perfect, not complete, but full of enough love to be called home. Miles' whisper, "That one's for Mom," felt like a gentle farewell, both heartbreaking and freeing. Family is not always the place we are born into. It's the place where the heart chooses to stay, where we find peace after loss. Have you ever witnessed a small act that changed an entire life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, rate this story from 0 to 10. To stay with us on this journey, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. And don't miss out. Click here to watch more now.